Who is poisoning me? And how did it happen that the only thread leads back to the one place I always felt safe, our kitchen? I keep asking myself that question as I lie in intensive care, listening to the machines count breaths for me. Pale green walls, sterile light, the sharp smell of bleach, and a sweet, heavy undertone that clings to my throat. An IV weighs down my left arm. My right is taken up by a catheter. A thin tube sits in my nose, and every breath feels like it isn't my decision. Every morning, a nurse comes for blood. In 2 weeks, I've stopped counting the needle sticks, but I've learned something else. The worse I get, the more vials they carry away. Yesterday was a liver biopsy. Local anesthetic, a thick needle, and a dull pain under my ribs. The day before yesterday was a lumbar puncture. Tomorrow is toxicology again, for the 5th time. My name is Art. I'm 38 and I'm a design engineer. I'm used to a world where every failure has a cause and a trace. I lived steadily. I didn't smoke, I barely drank, I went to the gym on weekends, I had no chronic diagnoses. A month ago, I passed a medical checkup, clean. And now the doctors have carefully explained to my wife that I may have less than a week left. My kidneys are working at about 20%, my liver is enlarged and damaged, and the labs show acute intoxication of unknown origin. The biopsy confirmed toxic injury, but the toxin's name remains a blank space, as if the poisoning left no signature. Toxicologists ran my blood through long lists of substances, and every time the answer was the same: no matches. Yesterday, a professor came from the regional center and asked me to reconstruct the timeline, when it started, how it progressed, whether there were new medications, supplements, changes in diet, renovations, contact with solvents. I listed everything and suddenly realized they were listening to me like a witness in my own case, not like a patient. The countdown started on the first Monday of June. I woke up with the fatigue that felt less like lack of sleep and more like a shutdown, as if someone had lowered my body's power to the minimum. At work, I blamed it on overtime. At home, Natalie noticed before I did. We've been together 11 years, and she can see changes even when I pretend everything is fine. The next morning, a bright green smoothie appeared in the kitchen. A tall glass, cold in my hand, the smell of mint and fresh greens. I asked what was in it. Spinach, banana, apple, mint, and some other immune herbs she'd found online. I didn't remember the names. It looked harmless. The taste was bitter and sharp, mint forward, with a faint metallic note that I chalked up to the blender. From that day, the smoothie became a daily ritual. Natalie made it almost without skipping, and sometimes she waited until I finished it to the last sip, as if that mattered. She didn't drink it herself, explaining that it was for me. I didn't question it. In a marriage, trust often shows up exactly like that. A week later, I started coming home and collapsing on the couch with no strength even for a shower. That's when a second ritual appeared, herbal tea in the evenings. It was dark, it smelled different from ordinary herbal blends, and each time it tasted slightly different. 3 weeks in, nausea and dizziness hit. My appetite disappeared. The weight dropped fast, my skin turned grayish. Natalie insisted I see a doctor, and I didn't resist. I only wanted the nausea to stop. The lab results came back in a way that wiped the smile off the therapist's face. They sent me for an ultrasound, then hospitalized me for tests, and after that, everything rolled downhill faster than I could track. A couple of days later, they moved me into intensive care. Now Natalie comes every day and stands behind the glass because no one is allowed in with me. She cries, wipes her tears, looks again. I see her fingers on the clear barrier, and I almost believe the closest person in my life is right there. Almost, because my main question doesn't go away. If this is poisoning, where did the chain begin? And why do all the traces lead back to what I drank at home? Today, the professor asked me to make a list of everything I ate and drank over the last 2 months, down to brands, packaging, and herbs. And the nurse, on her way out, added that tomorrow they'll need not only my labs, but whatever is still left in our kitchen. By noon, I'd already gotten used to masked people coming into my room and talking about my organs the way you discuss someone else's machinery. But today, something from outside the hospital system broke the sterile routine. The door opened, and instead of a doctor, 2 people in plain clothes walked in. A man around 50 with gray at his temples carried himself as if every step had been weighed in advance. Beside him was a younger woman with a notebook and a calm, steady gaze. Their IDs flashed quickly, but I understood the meaning immediately. Police. For a second, I thought they had the wrong room. The man sat down so he could see me fully and stated why they were there. If the toxicologist can't find an explainable source of intoxication, the police are required to check the criminal angle. He called it a formality, but there was nothing formal in his tone. The woman wrote without looking up. I tried to pull myself together. A dry throat, weakness, and the feeling that my thoughts were moving slower than the questions. They gave me water, helped prop me up, and the interview slid into the pattern I knew from movies. Enemies, conflicts, debts, threats, revenge. I sifted through people and events like folders on a desktop, and in each one I found emptiness. At work, I had deadlines, not wars. At home, routine. My denial started to sound repetitive even to me. Then the man asked who cooks my food. The answer was obvious, Natalie. A short pause settled in the room, and for the first time I felt fear change its shape. Until then, I'd been afraid of an unknown toxin. Now I was afraid that the unknown might be too close. They asked for Natalie to be brought in. The nurse left, and the waiting felt like a separate procedure. Machines, even light, my breathing. When Natalie came in, she moved fast, like she'd been running down the hallway, and then stopped the moment she saw strangers. Her face looked worried, but composed. The woman wrote without looking up. I tried to pull myself together. A dry throat, weakness, and the feeling that my thoughts were moving slower than the questions. They gave me water, helped prop me up, and the interview slid into the pattern I knew from movies. Enemies, conflicts, debts, threats, revenge. I sifted through people and events like folders on a desktop, and in each one I found emptiness. At work, I had deadlines, not wars. At home, routine. My denial started to sound repetitive even to me. Then the man asked who cooks my food. The answer was obvious, Natalie. A short pause settled in the room, and for the first time I felt fear change its shape. Until then, I'd been afraid of an unknown toxin. Now I was afraid that the unknown might be too close. They asked for Natalie to be brought in. The nurse left, and the waiting felt like a separate procedure. Machines, even light, my breathing. When Natalie came in, she moved fast, like she'd been running down the hallway, and then stopped the moment she saw strangers. Her face looked worried, but composed. The officer explained that he would ask a few questions. He spoke evenly and politely, but I caught the difference. A doctor searches for a diagnosis. A police officer searches for motive. Natalie sat down, clasped her hands on her knees, and began listing what she'd fed me over the past few weeks. Soups, porridge, meat, vegetables, salads, the same store, ordinary groceries. It all sounded too correct, as if she'd prepared a report in advance. When they got to supplements and herbs, there was a 1-second hesitation. Not a pause to remember, a pause to choose. Natalie said she tried to support me with plant-based drinks, bright green morning smoothies and herbal infusions at night. She listed familiar fruit and greens and then added a couple more items that sounded like names from someone else's medicine cabinet. A duty doctor was standing near the door. He'd been silently watching until then, but at one of the names he snapped his head up and asked her to clarify what form it had been purchased in and how it was used. Natalie explained that she'd ordered concentrates online and added them to the blender by eye, guided by reviews. The doctor left the room so quickly, it felt like he needed to check a thought against reality immediately. The officer asked about dosages, packaging, timing. The woman with the notebook recorded the answers as if she were marking points on a map. I watched Natalie and caught myself looking for more than fear for me. I was looking for fear for herself. She was crying, but the tears didn't erase the care with which she chose each word. When the doctor came back, he had printouts and orders for additional tests. He explained that plant substances in concentrated form sometimes require separate screening and don't always show up on standard panels. He didn't say he'd found the cause, but from the way he avoided final statements, I understood. A version had appeared, one that, for the first time, looked workable. The officer didn't draw conclusions out loud. He simply looked at Natalie longer than a formality requires and said the investigation would continue. When they left, the room held only Natalie and my hand in her palm. And inside me, a cold question formed. If she truly acted on guesswork, why did everything about her look like someone used to double-checking every detail? And if the herbs theory turns out to be a false lead, it still looks too plausible to ignore. Before sleep, they told me that tomorrow they'll ask us to bring everything from home connected to those drinks. Packets, jars, receipts, even the blender blades. 3 days passed, and for the first time, this story had something that looked like a working theory. The results of specialized tests came back to the ward and made the doctors noticeably more alert. They'd found traces of plant-derived compounds in my blood, enough to explain part of the picture. No one called it a 100% answer. Too much in my labs was still gray, but the tone changed. In the orders, there was direction now, and in the doctor's words, for the first time, a cautious chance. Treatment stopped being a blind fight with symptoms and started to look like an attempt to drag the toxic exposure out of the shadows. They added drugs to help clear toxins and support my liver and kidneys, drew up a trajectory measured in weeks instead of hours. The medical phrasing still circled around the same point. The toxic injury is confirmed, but the source still has to be caught and named precisely. If my body holds, they might pull me through, but after that, there'll be a long recovery and a life lived by strict rules. Yesterday, they let Natalie in, not behind the glass. She walked in and her face gave her away immediately. Red eyes, swollen lids, dark circles, movements sharp and exhausted. She held my hand as if she was afraid I'd disappear if she let go. She apologized and tried to explain that she acted out of care and never imagined what her natural support could turn into. And that was when the first crack appeared in me. I'd known Natalie for 11 years. She wasn't careless. Her strength had always been in details. Instructions, lists, double checks, the habit of doing everything the right way. That's why the idea that she'd been adding concentrates into my drinks by eye for 2 months without sorting out dosages or warnings stuck to me like a hangnail. I didn't say it out loud, but doubt became a symptom of its own. That morning, the captain came, polite, dry, with the voice of someone used to not showing emotion. He made it clear that for now it still looked like an accident, but the investigation had to run its full course. From the apartment, they'd taken everything connected to my drinks: leftover herbs, packaging, receipts, order histories. They were checking devices and search queries, not to accuse, but to understand what exactly was purchased and why. The captain asked whether I'd noticed changes in Natalie's behavior in recent months, and to my surprise, I could list too much. Late work days that used to be rare had become routine. She came home late 2 or 3 times a week, tired and silent, like someone holding a conversation inside herself, but not for me. Her phone became an extension of her hand. It used to lie anywhere. Now it was always within reach. Once, when I reached for it automatically to check the weather, her reaction was sharp, almost frightened. Later, she explained it as confidentiality around work, and I believed her. Another detail felt trivial until I ended up on the edge of death. She stopped asking about my day. Dinner turned into silence, and then she'd go into the other room and seem to power down, leaving me nearby, but not with her. I asked them to bring me my phone and logged into our shared family cloud account, where our photos were backed up automatically. It wasn't spying, it was a way to grab on to reality. I scrolled through her pictures from the past few months, presentations, documents, event shots, everything logical. And then I found a folder with a neutral name, the kind people use to hide something personal. Inside were her selfies in a cafe, in a park, outside a restaurant. In several shots, a man appeared next to her, not fully, as if the camera kept cutting him off on purpose. A hand on the back of a chair, the edge of a shoulder, a profile in the background. I didn't know him, but I saw something else. Natalie was smiling there in a way she never smiled at home, smiling freely. The dates on the photos were ordinary weekday evenings. On some of those days, she came home close to midnight, explaining it as work. Back then, it felt normal. Now, it became a mismatch. I set the phone down and stared at the ceiling for a long time, trying not to assemble the conclusion my brain assembles automatically. If the herbs theory is true, then it started as a mistake. If it isn't, then someone handed me a convenient cause. And if the truth is hiding somewhere between those options, then the most important part still hasn't been said. I lay under the IV lines and asked myself, honestly for the first time, do I actually know the person I've lived with for 11 years, or have I just gotten used to the role she played? Some investigations don't start with fingerprints. They start with someone else's phone and a few lines on a bank statement. Today, I realized mine is exactly that kind. Captain Sokolov came alone and closed the hospital room door the way people do, not for quiet, but for meaning. He went straight to it. They had checked Natalie's phone. Access, he said, was voluntary. She gave passwords without being pushed. Inside was an ordinary life: work chats, family, friends, health searches, links to articles and advice she'd been using to try to get me back on my feet. For a moment, I felt lighter, because any scrap of normality in here feels like rescue. Then the captain named one contact that didn't fit the overall picture. A man named Dennis, Natalie's coworker. Their messages had been daily for the past 4 months. Sokolov spoke in dry phrasing, but I heard something else. Daily isn't an accident, it's a habit. On the surface, the chat looked clean, mostly work topics, tasks, deadlines. But the tone was too warm for a strictly professional coworker, too personal in the small details. And it turned out they'd met outside the office, cafes, walks, one evening after work together, which Natalie described as discussing a project in an informal setting. Formally, there was nothing you could grab onto, and that was what scared me most. The captain didn't draw conclusions out loud. He only said the check would continue, because a warm tone and frequent meetings aren't a crime. But paired with my poisoning, they looked like an extra piece that didn't belong. And at the door, he added a second detail that hit harder: Natalie's finances. Over the last 3 months, she'd withdrawn large sums of cash several times. Not once and not small amounts. Altogether, it was a lot. The explanation sounded every day: gifts, household needs, helping relatives. But the statements didn't show any renovation, any purchases that usually leave traces. The cash disappeared into a blank space. No receipts, no familiar logic. For someone used to calculations, it felt like a hole punched straight through a diagram. Unusual or unexplained cash withdrawals are commonly treated as a financial red flag, precisely because they can't be easily traced like card purchases. After Sokolov left, the room felt too quiet. I already had one chain of events: smoothies in the morning, infusions at night, worsening day by day, a diagnosis the doctors called toxic damage to my liver and kidneys. Now 2 more lines had been added: Dennis and the money. The more lines appeared, the harder it became to hold on to the simple mistake version. In the evening, Natalie came. She was happy that my numbers looked slightly better, and she clung to that news as if it was the only thing she could still control. I looked at her and caught a strange sensation. The person sitting beside me wasn't my wife. It was someone I still had to understand. I didn't interrogate her. I asked questions carefully, as if each word might destroy what was left of trust. I mentioned Dennis and saw a brief reaction. One instant of stillness, like she was checking the correct answer. Then she explained that he was a project coworker, that the frequent communication was because of work, and that the police had already seen everything because she had nothing to hide. I asked about the cash. Natalie answered just as evenly: ordinary spending, gifts, helping out, buying things where it's simply easier not to use a card. In her version, it all sounded explainable, but it lacked the pedantic detail I knew in her. She was tired of the hospital, tired of checks, tired of feeling like a suspect, and she left earlier than usual. That night, I opened the cloud again and looked through the photos. In them, Natalie was alive and happy, and next to her, an intentionally cropped male silhouette I didn't recognize. Her late returns and my trusting nods floated back into my memory. Now it didn't look like routine, it looked like a pattern. The worst part was something else. Each detail on its own could be innocent, but if those details ever lock into one explanation, I'm not sure I'll learn it in time. Right before sleep, the night nurse passed along a strange request. Tomorrow, investigators want to clarify a few small points with Natalie, and they asked me to prepare a list of people who'd been in our home in recent months, or could have had access to the kitchen. I stared at my phone screen, at the dark glass of the window, and understood the circle of questions was widening, which meant the circle of suspicion was widening too.
Why are people so sure the most dangerous lie sounds loud when it can just as easily whisper, hiding in the smallest details? I think about that every time I pass the security desk and hear the hospital door close behind me. My name is Natalie, I'm 36, and my husband is in intensive care. The doctors say his trend is better, that there's a chance now that the treatment has finally hit the target, and they keep calling his condition toxic injury, something they're trying to reverse. I should be clinging to those words with both hands, but I'm clinging to something else. Art's eyes. He looks at me like I didn't come to save him. I came to finish him off. Distrust is worse than any procedure. The police are checking everything connected to me, my phone, my cards, my habits, my circle. They move calmly and methodically, like people who know the truth hides inside routine. I give access, answer questions, explain, but the more I explain, the more I feel that I'm still being examined as a theory. The worst part is that Art has started doing the same. I can see him assembling a picture of me, and in that picture, details appear that never used to matter. My late returns, cash withdrawals, a stranger's name that now sounds like an alarm. I want to drag us back into the past, but the past was held together by trust, and trust doesn't return on command. 4 months ago, everything looked different. In the spring, work offered me a spot on a new project team. Big client, big deadlines, a chance to move up. I agreed immediately, because opportunities like that don't come twice. Dennis was on the team. Before that, he'd been just a hallway coworker. Hellos, rare crossovers, nothing personal. The project brought us closer, not through romance, but through time. 10 hours side by side, the same deadlines, the same mistakes you have to fix late into the night. At first, we talked only about tasks. Then we started talking about life, like people do when they're surviving at the same pace. He knew how to release the tension so that for a minute you felt alive again. I didn't tell Art much about Dennis. Not because I was hiding him, but because I didn't think I needed to list every person I work with. But now I understand how it looks. The less you say, the more space you leave for suspicion. Yes, we met outside the office. Sometimes it was easier than sitting in a conference room again. A quick coffee, a walk after a brutal day, an attempt to clear your head. Once we ended up alone somewhere that was supposed to be a group thing. In that moment, it never crossed my mind that someone would call it evidence. Money became the second piece of evidence. I really did withdraw cash. I didn't want Art to see traces in the statements, because I was preparing a surprise and convincing myself I was doing something good for us. But on police paperwork, cash doesn't look like a dream, it looks like a shadow. And there's a third detail, the most poisonous one. Those herbal supplements I found online, those concentrates that seemed harmless because the word natural sounds like a guarantee. I read reviews, watched advice videos, and believed that if it's sold openly, it must be safe. I thought I was helping Art fight exhaustion. Now I know the price of that confidence. When Art asks questions, I answer evenly, but inside everything tightens. I can explain Dennis, I can explain the money. I can explain my mistake with the supplements. Each one on its own can look like the truth. The problem is that truth isn't always whole. There are things I'm not telling anyone, not the police, not the doctors, not Art. Not because it's a crime in their sense, because it's destruction in mine. If I say it out loud, our story loses any chance of becoming what it used to be, even if Art survives. Today, walking out of his room, I caught myself thinking, I'm not afraid he'll die, I'm afraid he'll recover and start remembering everything in the right order. Because order turns coincidence into a system, and a system always leads to the only question that matters. Who started this, and why? They didn't summon me through a doctor and not by a call from the hospital. It was official. For the first time in these weeks, I understood the difference. When questions were asked in hallways and patient rooms, you could treat it like background noise to a tragedy. A written summons, time, address, wasn't background. It was a frame they were placing around me as a possible cause. A summons is an official notice ordering someone to appear. The station greeted me with simple things that make you go cold. A long corridor, doors without signs, a metallic taste in my mouth, and the feeling that every step sounded too loud. In the office, there was a table, 2 chairs, and a recorder lying there, like it was the main witness. Captain Sokolov was there, and Detective Krylova. I knew their faces from the hospital, but here they looked different, calmer, stricter, closer to people who don't believe words by default. The conversation started with what counts as normal, our marriage. I talked about how we'd lived together for 11 years, how we met back in university, how we built a life. They asked about habits, routines, who came home when. At some point, I caught myself thinking I wasn't describing a family. I was describing an access system, who had opportunity, who could interfere without being noticed. Then they moved to Dennis. His name was spoken as if it wasn't a person, but an exhibit. I had to explain how we started working together in the spring, why we texted every day, and why we met outside the office. I talked about the project, deadlines, exhaustion, the habit of discussing tasks, somewhere you can actually breathe. But they weren't interested in the project. They were interested in why I hadn't told Art about him. I repeated what I'd said before. I didn't think it mattered. I didn't want to turn home into a report about coworkers. The words sounded logical, but the room wasn't built for logic. In that room, they measure pauses, and my pauses got longer. Printouts of messages went onto the table. Not the whole chat, fragments, the parts where the tone became too personal. There was a lot of warmth there, a lot of lines that can be misread if you're looking at them from the investigator side of a desk, while knowing my husband is lying there with toxic organ damage. I explained that friendship can be close too, that sometimes people say too much when they're tired. They asked me to answer directly. Were there relations, an affair? I said no, and I saw that in their coordinate system, no is only another version. Then came the money. Bank statements were spread out like a route map. Cash withdrawal dates, amounts, repetition. They asked where it went. First, I hid behind the universal household, then latched onto the word help, and out of inertia, mentioned my mother. And almost immediately, I realized I'd made a mistake. It wasn't an explanation. It was a retreat. When they told me that version didn't check out, something inside me snapped loose. They asked me to name, specifically, what I'd spent the cash on. And that's where I hit the wall I'd built myself. I could have shown them direction, maybe even proof, but I understood. In that room, any hidden action automatically becomes suspicious, even if there's no crime in it. Then they returned to food. They asked how often I cooked for Art, who bought groceries, who might have been home alone while I was at work. The question sounded like a household inventory, but the meaning was different. Access, opportunity, control. I could hear it between the lines. They also made me lay out, step by step, the story of the supplements again. Where I found them, what I read, what I ordered, how I stored them, how I measured them. I talked about internet advice, blind faith in the word natural, my stupidity and fear for my husband. The more I talked, the clearer it became. Mistake isn't an alibi. At the end, they asked if there was anything I was withholding. And I understood I was trapped. If I speak, they'll misunderstand. If I stay silent, they'll decide I'm hiding the main thing. I chose silence and walked out into the street with the feeling that they'd only released me physically. At home, it was quiet. I sat down on the hallway floor and, for the first time all day, let myself stop holding my face together. Then I got up, went to the bedroom, and took a box down from the top shelf, one I'd hidden for a long time, carefully. Inside were papers, receipts, and the traces of my choices. I stared at them and thought something simple. If the police find this box first, they'll get an answer. The only question is what kind.
If you'd asked me a week ago what I feared most, I would have said a project collapse and a public mistake. Today, I'm afraid of something else. That someone else's tragedy will suddenly carry my name as a footnote, and that one day I might start believing that version myself. My name is Dennis. I'm the coworker they now pull out of any context like the wrong part in a mechanism. The contact in Natalie's phone that feels too convenient for the investigation. I'm not the one in ICU listening to someone's organs fail, but the pressure is familiar. When people look at you not as a person, but as a possible cause. The police reached me quickly and quietly. The question seemed simple. How long have I known Natalie? How often do we talk? Why did we meet outside the office? I answered evenly and correctly. Work, project, friendship. The more correct my words sounded, the more clearly I understood that this was exactly what made them suspicious. Because when there's poisoning and a hospital bed, just friends sounds like a pre-made excuse. I really was close to Natalie these past months. Not literally every minute, but in the way that's harder to prove and easier to suspect. The project drained both of us, and between meetings and deadlines, there were short gaps where a person either stays silent or speaks too honestly. Natalie usually chose the second. I told the investigators we were coworkers, that's true, but I didn't tell them how quickly her presence became a habit for me. I didn't say that I noticed her messages before work notifications. I didn't say that sometimes I caught myself getting irritated when she went offline, and I didn't know where she was or why she wasn't answering. Those aren't facts of a crime. They're facts of dependence, and that's exactly what makes a person vulnerable. They were interested in the messages. They pulled out lines where the warmth showed and asked me to explain the tone. I explained it as fatigue, stress, shared work, jokes on autopilot. I acted like nothing meant more than it did. And at some point, I caught myself realizing I wasn't protecting Natalie. I was protecting my own version of myself, the one who didn't interfere. Then they asked about the meetings. I repeated that we discussed the project somewhere you can breathe, not under the harsh light of a conference room. I didn't add one small detail: how easily talking about the project becomes a reason not to go home, and how fast you develop the habit of choosing not a route, but a person. The most dangerous part of their questions was something else. They asked them like people who already know the ending, and are only checking whether my story matches their picture. They asked about everyday things, times, minor details people usually forget. For example, did I know Natalie was trying to support her husband with natural remedies? I said I'm not a doctor, not an advisor. That was almost true again. Because I didn't prescribe her anything and I didn't give instructions, but my memory held on to one moment. A late evening, her anxiety, the need for a simple solution. I didn't remember names, but I remembered how easily the internet promises miracles. I remembered how links get sent with one flick of a finger. I remembered us talking about how natural sounds safer than pills. After that thought came another. If investigators dig deeper, they'll find more than her browser history. They'll find mine too. I don't know what's really happening to Art. I only know that a chain has been built around him. Drinks, decline, money, a stranger's name. And in that chain, my name looks too perfect. Because I really was close. Because I saw Natalie as someone else. Alive, smiling, the way she didn't look at work, and, it seems, hadn't looked at home in a long time. I told the police I didn't care. And that was my least convincing sentence. I do care. I care what happens to her. I care whether her husband survives, because that will decide not only her life, but who I become in her story. A random coworker, or the man who knew too much. In thrillers, an unreliable narrator keeps tension by hiding part of the truth, even from himself. I'd like to say that isn't me. But when an unknown number lit up my screen again that evening, I didn't pick up right away. First, I wondered how they got my contact, and what else, besides the contact, they'd already found.
What's more frightening, a toxin in the blood or the thought that the toxin might have come from inside the family? I ask that not as a dramatic device, but as a working tool. It shows the exact point where a person stops seeing facts and starts defending themselves. They brought me in when the medical explanation stopped being the only one. Art survived the point where, in intensive care, they usually stop promising anything. His chart now includes toxic injury and specialized testing, but alongside that, a second reality has appeared. Police, checks, messages, cash, a stranger's name. In situations like this, people think they're talking about the cause of an illness, but they're actually talking about trust. Art now looks like someone carrying two traumas at once. The first is physical: pain, weakness, fear, dependence on procedures, the sensation of losing control. The second is psychological: a crack in basic safety, when home stops being a shelter and becomes a place where harm could have begun. After that, a predictable chain starts. Trust falls, suspicion grows, and with it grows the need to control everything. Verify, reconstruct timelines, search for inconsistencies. It can resemble jealousy, but it's really a reaction to a threat to attachment. Research has linked low trust and anxious attachment with increased cognitive and behavioral jealousy, including surveillance/snooping behaviors, especially under conditions of distrust that feel like betrayal. In art, that reaction shows up not in speeches, but in attention to details: who went where, on which days, which late nights happened, why the phone became guarded, why the smile disappeared at home and appeared in photos. Natalie looks different in this story. She isn't so much defending herself as trying to hold on to an image of herself. Her psyche is anchored in the role of the caring wife, and any doubt in that role is experienced as a personal catastrophe. Under an investigator's gaze and by an ICU bed, she shows a common caregiver reaction: guilt that grows even where objective guilt may be unclear. This is often described as caregiver guilt, tied to self-blame and fear of "I didn't do enough" or "I did it wrong." But Natalie has another layer too, a split between needs and what feels permissible. When someone spends years trying to be the right one, they often stop naming what they actually want and start solving problems indirectly. Where there should be a conversation about boundaries, exhaustion, and shared load, silence appears. And where there should be silence, a secret appears. Dennis in this system doesn't have to be the culprit, but he matters as a catalyst. He became an external source of validation, attention, and emotional decompression. In psychology, this is often described as emotional closeness shifting outward. When a friendship starts competing with the marriage, not through events, but through priority. Signs that a boundary is shifting typically include secrecy, frequent messaging, sharing intimate personal problems, and the feeling that this person understands me better. The most dangerous thing in these triangles isn't the contact itself. It's that the couple stops being a team. One starts looking for proof, another starts producing justifications, and the third gets an easy role, the one who understands. That breaks trust faster than any external circumstance. When I look at the investigation materials, I see not one motive, but several competing explanations. The herbs explanation looks like a version that is convenient for everyone. For doctors, because it offers a mechanism. For police, because it offers a scenario. For Natalie, because it's error, not intent. For art, because it can be accepted as an accident without destroying the marriage completely. But a convenient version is always suspicious in one way. It seals the fear too neatly. My task at this stage is not to name a culprit, but to understand where each of them is lying to themselves. Because people rarely lie only to investigators. First, they lie to their own shame. And when I lay their lines side by side, I get the sense that there's one motive in this story no one says out loud. Not because it's criminal, but because it's too humiliating. And those are exactly the motives people hide best. Investigations have a dangerous stage, the moment it becomes beneficial for everyone to pick one suspect. After that, facts start getting fitted to a person instead of the person being fitted to the facts. That was the stage at which they brought me in. This is a classic form of confirmation bias, favoring information that supports an existing belief. In the first days, police looked at Natalie as the obvious version: access to food, secrecy, cash, late returns. But the more explanations they received, the stronger the need became to find a second, someone who would give the motive shape and make the story feel complete. That's how Dennis entered the case. To the investigation, Dennis looked almost perfect. A man nearby, frequent messaging, meetings outside work, a warm tone that's easy to read as intimacy, and next to that, a husband who suddenly lands in ICU with toxic injury to his organs. With that set, the brain draws the classic script by itself: lover, competition, removal. I watched that version cling to people. It's convenient because it eliminates uncertainty. If Dennis is guilty, Art gets a clear enemy. If Dennis is guilty, the police get a clean investigative trajectory. But convenient versions always make me wary, because they resolve fear too neatly. I asked for Dennis's material separately: the messages, his explanations, the time points where he could have been close, and the details investigators had flagged. On paper, it looked tense, but not lethal. No direct threats, no signs of preparation. A lot of emotion, yes. A lot of concealment, yes. But concealment more often points to shame than to crime. Research on secrecy suggests shame is associated with being more mentally preoccupied by the secret, while guilt shows a different pattern, meaning the emotional meaning of what's hidden matters, not only the act of hiding. I met Dennis without morality and without accusations. I wasn't watching his answers. I was watching how he chose words. His speech was measured. He carried himself like he was afraid not of the truth, but of a phrasing that could sound like a confession. He denied a romantic relationship, and I couldn't prove otherwise. But the denial sounded too correct. When people tell the truth, they often allow chaos. They clarify, they stumble, they circle back to details. Dennis spoke as if he had a prepared version. Police called that calculation. I called it fear. Fear of becoming not a killer, but the reason someone else's world collapsed. Dennis was emotionally involved. You can hear it in how he described Natalie, not as a co-worker, but as someone he wants to save and support. He talked about the project, but again and again he returned to her exhaustion, to the sense that she was holding on by her fingernails. That kind of gaze is rarely neutral. And still, I didn't see cruelty in him. I didn't see that cold certainty common in people ready to cause harm to achieve a goal. His energy was different, nervous, defensive, too human. When I told police that the Dennis version didn't look central to me yet, I met irritation. Investigations need answers. Psychology needs questions. Investigation likes direct motives. Psychology knows the strongest motives often hide inside the everyday. Even so, I couldn't fully clear him, because the story still had holes. One hole is information. Dennis knew more about Natalie's marital strain than a simple co-worker usually knows. He knew about her fatigue and her search for solutions. And when someone knows about a weakness, they gain influence. The second hole is time. In their messages, there were days that overlapped with Art's decline, and days when Natalie stayed late specifically after contact with Dennis. It isn't proof, but it's linkage. The third hole is the theme of natural remedies. Dennis said he didn't give advice, but in his language certain words surfaced, words that usually belong to conversations beyond deadlines. Calm down, take the edge off, dampen. He didn't name substances, but investigators don't always start with names. They start with direction. I left that meeting with a double sense. Dennis could have been a reason the marriage started breaking, emotionally. But I wasn't ready to name him the source of a threat to life. And that is what makes this story dangerous. when destruction and crime look identical from the outside. That evening, I went back to the timeline again and saw what the versions kept missing. Too many people in this case are trying to save face. And when people save face, they hide more than feelings. They hide motives. And until a motive is named, any Dennis remains a convenient shadow. I always recognize the moment when someone becomes truly afraid, not when a diagnosis is spoken and not even when the police arrive. People become truly afraid when they have to say their motive out loud. In this case, the motive hid for a long time behind versions, behind an accident, behind stupidity, behind friendship, behind a failed attempt to help. Each of those versions could be defended with facts. That's why the case dragged on. The truth wasn't where everyone was looking. I started with a simple professional rule. If a person is meticulous and then suddenly accidentally breaks their own principles exactly at the point where it changes someone else's life, then they didn't break them by accident. Natalie wasn't someone who measures by eye. She was someone who controls. And when she repeated the word mistake, it didn't sound like confession. It sounded like a shield. The second rule is about shame. Shame makes people inventive. It forces them to hide not a crime, but a need that feels humiliating. And those are exactly the needs people almost never discuss directly inside a marriage. Shame thrives on secrecy, and secrecy is where indirect solutions are born. When I asked Art to talk about events, he talked about facts and about trust collapsing. His jealousy and suspicion weren't a whim. They were a reaction to a threat to attachment and safety. Losing control over your body almost always triggers an attempt to regain control through investigation. Natalie responded differently. She drowned in guilt and explanations, which resembles caregiver guilt, the self-blaming pattern where a person fears they didn't do enough or did it wrong, and therefore must justify themselves endlessly. But neither jealousy nor guilt explained one thing: why the chain began with rituals, not with real treatment. The key wasn't Dennis's messages, and it wasn't even the cash. The key was the box Natalie kept at home, and the way she held it when she finally brought it in. Not like a gift, not like proof of innocence, like something too shameful to show. Inside weren't just receipts. There were printouts, notes, saved pages, orders, screenshots, not about energy and immunity. There were searches about how to reduce male desire, how to calm libido, and how to do it so a man wouldn't notice. There were names of plant-based products with sedative and hormone-like effects, and dosing schemes written in Natalie's handwriting in a notebook, alongside dates and the words morning and evening. And then what wouldn't fit before finally locked into place. Natalie didn't want Art dead. She wanted quiet. She wanted Art's body to stop demanding what she couldn't give anymore. And this is where the second line appears, the one she was hiding even from herself. Dennis wasn't just a co-worker. He was an affair, not the kind that starts with plans, but the kind that starts with the feeling of finally being seen. It was emotional infidelity sliding toward physical. Secrecy, constant messaging, meetings, the feeling that this is where you're understood. Many descriptions of emotional affairs highlight exactly those signs: frequent contact, secrecy, and emotional intimacy redirected away from the partner. Natalie couldn't sustain the double life, but she couldn't stop either side, because one side gave stability and habit, and the other gave aliveness. So her mind chose the most dangerous compromise. Not divorce, not an honest conversation, not boundaries. A compromise in the form of a substance. She wasn't looking for something to boost immunity. She was looking for something to lower her husband's sexual drive and buy time. In her head, it could still look almost humane. Don't destroy the marriage, don't confess, don't hurt him, just remove the problem. But Art's body didn't respond with reduced desire. It responded with a toxic blow to the liver and kidneys. Herbal products and supplements can, in some cases, be associated with liver injury, and some herbal substances are also known to carry kidney risks, especially depending on the ingredient and dose. Dennis in this scheme wasn't a doctor and wasn't the direct organizer, but he was the witness to her complaints. He supported her at the moment she was looking for indirect solutions, and he knew too much about what was happening at home. That's why his answers sounded polished. He was protecting not only Natalie, but his own role. When I put Natalie's motive into words, she stopped arguing, because there was nothing left to argue with. In that moment, the investigation ended, not because the police stamped a final line, but because Natalie admitted for the first time she wasn't saving her husband, she was trying to control him. And the most frightening thing here isn't the poisoning itself, it's how easily shame and fear can turn closeness into control, and control into a risk to life.